Welcome, everyone. Welcome to Leading with Empathy and Allyship. I am your host, Melinda Briana Epler, the founder and CEO of Change Catalyst, where we build inclusive innovation through training, consulting, and events. This series goes deep and gets real. We build empathy for underrepresented and historically marginalized people and provide tangible, actionable steps we can all take to be better allies and advocates for each other. On screen, we have Jasmine, an ASL interpreter today. The ASL interpretation is sponsored by Interpreter Now, a deaf-owned company we're really proud to partner with. Well, today we're exploring empathy, Islamophobia, or Muslim bias and discrimination, and Muslim identity. Please welcome Najeeba Syeed, Associate Professor at Claremont School of Theology. Welcome, Najeeba, and Ramadan Mubarak.
Oh, thank you. Yes, we are fasting for this month. We wake up at sunrise and eat before the sun rises and eat after the sun sets. So you may have people on your teams that are fasting. So about 29 to 30 days in succession.
Awesome. Yeah, we have two people on our team fasting now. Great. Well, can we start with you just saying a little bit about you? What is your story and how did you end up doing what you're doing today?
That's a great question. So I'm a professor who has this incredible job of teaching what's called interreligious education. And it's a really unique position where the institution, the graduate school where I teach, decided to invest. They were initially a mostly Christian institution, and they said, we really want to work with people of different religious traditions. So they started a position called interreligious education. So basically what I teach are courses about different religious traditions, working with one another, whether it's I teach a class right now that's called managing interreligious nonprofits. So such a wide range of topics, and you would be surprised how much literature there is now about working across religious traditions, both in religious settings, but also in settings such as the ones many of you are probably dealing with these days.
Awesome. And what brought you to that place? Where did you start? Where did you grow up? How did you get there?
Well, I immigrated to the United States when I was 3 years old. And I think I immigrated with my family. I wasn't that precocious that I got on an airplane and just came and established myself at the age of 3. I think that process of, when I was growing up, a lot of folks would consider their bicultural, meaning occupying two different cultures, as a deficit. And I have a friend, Manal Omar, that's written about this, and she says she always considered it a superpower. So instead of seeing it as a deficit, instead of saying, well, I don't fit in here and I don't fit in there, I don't fit in anywhere, she took it in her work. She does international development work, and she decided to make it an asset. And I think that has really been, I was doing that throughout my life, growing up, being able to adapt to many situations. And so it's kind of a skill that comes out of necessity, but it becomes an asset as we have to be in different situations, engage with different religious traditions. And my parents, I was very lucky. We were a very deeply practicing Muslim family, and they would also take us to a Sikh Gurdwara, to a Hindu temple, to a synagogue, to church, to experience on holidays and build friendships with other people. When there were people who would knock on the door trying to convince us to join their religion, my dad would say, come in and let's have a discussion. So from a really young age, I viewed religion as a big part of my life, but I also experienced and was able to have a language to be able to talk to people of different religious traditions.
Awesome. And what in your work right now is the most interesting, the most exciting for you?
I think one of the most exciting things, I just edited a volume on, it's called Experiments in Empathy. And it's nice. Muslim, Christian, and Jewish writers mostly, and a couple of authors that identify with maybe multiple religious traditions. We now have people that are called religiously fluid practitioners. So folks that may be of one religious tradition and then practice, yoga, meditation, not just as a practice, but actually get embodied in more than one religious tradition. So I thought, the volume was working with a group of professors from different religious traditions over a 3-year period, bringing them together, having conversation. What was really powerful about the idea of empathy that came out of the book was that wherever and however we do it, it's really an embodied process. It's not an idea. It's not a belief. It's not even necessarily a value, but how do we embody empathy at the individual level? And then how as institutions, for those folks that are familiar with the literature on cultural humility, how do you bring a whole institution or a whole community or a company into a place where they value not just diversity, but they begin to move into relationship with one another so that they're learning from one another and hopefully building their superpowers of cultural competency.
Awesome. So can you talk a little bit about Muslim identity? What does that identity mean for you personally? And
yeah, I think that's a really good question. And, one of the things is I'm speaking about my identity for participants, whether you're on the podcast or you're here with us today. And particularly if you're not Muslim, and maybe if you are as well, just take a second and pause. And when you hear the word Muslim, by the way, Muslims are the followers of Islam. Islam is the religious tradition itself. When you kind of conjure up in your mind, take a moment to think, when I hear the word Muslim, what's the first word that comes? What's the first word? What's the first image? I'll often have my students, if they're online, I'll say, bring the first image that doesn't show up necessarily in a search, but comes into your mind. And very often, the images that are conjured up, unfortunately, are often very associations with violence, associations with a very negative perspective of who a Muslim is. And they're even embodied in one way that Muslims look like. So I think it's important to kind of think through as we do this work, what are we bringing to the table in the imagery, the metaphors that we bring around who a Muslim is. And one thing that's always surprised people, for instance, I wear hijab. I cover my hair in a particular way, but there's so many different ways. And for instance, one thing that a lot of people don't realize is, in fact, probably the majority of Muslim women in the United States do not cover their hair. So you could be interacting or engaging with Muslim women in your workplace that have a vast difference around their practice. And that is the reality of it, but the image we carry in our mind about what a Muslim looks like, what a Muslim does, is often still static and caught in negative imagery. So I think that's really important to keep in mind, that Muslim identity is formed by religious practice. It's also formed by cultural and racial identity. One of the things that surprises a lot of folks is that in the United States, the majority of Arabs are actually Christian. They're not Muslim. And so very often Islam or Muslims are placed in one region of the world. And it's really important to understand that, for instance, the most populous Muslim country right now in the world is Indonesia. And then in fact, India or South Asia is moving into being another one of the most populous Muslim countries in the world. So where we physically even locate Islam on a map informs how and who we see as Muslim. So it's been funny for me that almost universally when I enter a room, either as a lecturer or as a professor or doing training in diversity, I'll put up on the board sometimes before I say something, I'll say, "Where do you think I'm from?" And it's fascinating because I'm South Asian, born in Kashmir, and it's fascinating that almost always the answers assume that I am, for instance, Arab American. And the idea that Muslims would exist in South Asia is um, is fascinating for some people. They don't even know how to get to that point. So I think the geography of Muslim identity, and as we know in the United States, one of the largest Muslim communities is African American. So Muhammad Ali is a very important figure for Islam in America, and that these are Muslims, for many, some are convert into the tradition, but many are third, fourth, if not multiple generations of Muslims, and that Muslims have been in the United States before its inception. So I think it's really important to think through that geographic location of Islam, because very often it's associated with only one ethnic or language community, and the vastness of who will be in your workplace. You may see race first or ethnicity and not see religion. So actually many Muslims are invisibilized in the workplace because of the fact that as managers, we may put people in boxes when we see a woman in hijab, or we see a man who has a beard and somehow looks like whatever that image that the media is always kind of pushing into our minds about what a Muslim looks like, what a Muslim sounds like. So yeah, I guess that would be part of the way I would want us to think about identity, is adding all the other factors of race, community, religion, national origin, ethnicity, culture, language, food, because it's Ramadan and I'm hungry. I have to think about food. People even ask me, they'll say, is there one food that Muslims like? And I will often say, that really depends. What we bring to a South Asian home may be very different than what someone would bring, in an African American Muslim community. There isn't always one universal, one universal culture around daily existence.
Yeah, we with this series that is coming up over and over again, that, we talk about one identity, and we identify people often as one identity, and it's really, we are this intersectional, beautiful, beautiful world of intersectionality, where many of us have several identities that converge together to become one whole human. So let's talk a little bit about Islamophobia and anti-Muslim bias and discrimination. What types of things come up, especially in the workplace, but in general, because I think that things that come up outside of the workplace, we bring that within us to the workplace?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. And one of the things as we prepped for this conversation is I was talking about this notion of many of us who do this work now. Islamophobia has currency now. It's become a popular term. It's not a term that's been around for 60, 70 years. It's a term that developed through reports that were done on anti-Muslim bias, and it kind of took currency and became popular. So while I think it has a particular history that's important, and it comes out of a set of practices, one of the reasons I think it's really important to understand that when we say Islamophobia, for most people, that doesn't mean you can't be critical of Islam or Muslims. In fact, Muslims themselves are very critical. If I sit with my mom and dad, pretty much any discussion is what could Muslims do better? So it's I think that's really important to put out there, because sometimes when we are human resources professionals, religion is a scary topic to get into. Religion is a difficult topic to approach. And sometimes managers or team leaders have told me, I don't touch religion or talk about religion. And that actually doesn't serve, as we said earlier, different forms of identity well. So one of the things that I found helpful, and others who are doing interfaith work or work across multiple religious traditions, is to identify it as anti-Muslim bias, because it's not that one is calling for always say positive things about Islam. You can't be critical about Islam. It's actually the bias that exists within individuals or institutions or systems related to a Muslim identity. So thinking about that helps, because I think very often it gives us the vocabulary to say, what are some of the issues that Muslims may particularly face? So for instance, we now know that around election cycles, national election cycles, there is an uptick, and this is usually, we can empirically watch this happen, of hate crimes against Muslims because of the language and the scapegoating of Muslim populations. And for instance, some of the case studies that I've dealt with in the workplace, a young student at a college, we were in a session around diversity, and I was working with the human resources department, and he came up to me afterwards and took me aside and said, Professor Syeed, you know, I want you to know that I have a Muslim sounding name and I don't use it anymore because I'm afraid that I will be targeted for anti-Muslim bias or speech. So anti-Muslim bias can be found in forms of speech. It can be found in forms of workplace harassment. It can be found in ways that people are not even hired. So if you look at, for instance, I remember actually a family member who changed his name from Osama. Osama is a given name that he was not named after. He was not named after Osama bin Laden. That was his name that he had way before that incident and then of 9/11. But he was worried about having that name and being able to get hired without bias, or having bias against him. So the bias can begin even before you're hired. Do you get into the door? Do you get clients? And I think that's a really important question if you're in a client-based industry. What do you do if a client says, I don't want that person because they're Muslim? Or they may not even be that descriptive, but I've seen that also come up in client-based industries where, what do you do as a manager when someone introduces anti-Muslim bias, not in the workplace, but on the client side, and how do you handle that? And I've seen numbers of cases around that as well, where the preference is for someone who is not Muslim. I think it's also important to keep in mind here, and this is something we also spoke about, is that who is perceived to be Muslim is not always ontologically correct. By that, I mean, someone may not even be Muslim, but kind of that identity is attached to them. So for instance, in the United States, among Sikh Americans, S-I-K-H, Sikh men with turbans, which is part of their religious practice, and beards, both deeply spiritual, deeply held religious beliefs, not just preferences, similar to the coverage of my hair, very deeply held religious beliefs for those who do it. Again, you know, not everyone does all of these things in any religious tradition, as we said. They were actually, that community has been the most targeted for violent hate crimes. And I think that's important to keep in mind, is anti-Muslim bias may operate against people who identify as Muslim, and it may operate against people who are also put into the community by the perception of whomever is viewed as Muslim. So it's a very complex kind of bias. And if we add to it, as you mentioned earlier, intersectional identity, add to it, for instance, someone who, as many of us deal with xenophobia, if you're an immigrant and you're also Muslim. And the majority of Muslims in the United States, it's one of the most diverse religious communities. There are some Muslims who are white, but the vast majority of Muslims are non-white. So whether they're immigrants or African-American Muslims, which is a large population, thinking about all of those different biases that are already existing, and add to that an element around religion. This is a very rich conversation to have, and I think probably much longer than just this brief engagement, that I'm so delighted that you're open to having a conversation about its depth, because sometimes I think, like you said, people come to the table and they say, oh, let's talk about Muslim identity. And it means we want to fast, we want holidays, and it's actually, I think, a lot more deeper. So I would just encourage you to think about the notion of anti-Muslim bias, if that gives you a language that's easier to use and kind of correlates with other forms of bias. And I would kind of I think Melinda just kind of end my comments on this here, is that the more that you can think of anti-Muslim bias and integrating it into your anti-racism education, your cross-cultural competency training, cross-cultural communication, it just helps to be able to see it as a form of bias instead of always pushing it out, and understanding that it does operate. Unfortunately, empirically, we know that it does exist.
Yeah. So you've done a lot of work around empathy. Can you talk a little bit about what empathy is to you and how we counter those anti-Muslim biases while building empathy?
So I think empathy, I talk about it as embodied empathy. And what we're trying to build in our workplaces is a religiously pluralistic society in many ways. So I think about, this is just a term you may want to explore more, this idea of religious pluralism, that there is racial diversity, ethnic diversity, language diversity, and then there's this idea of religious pluralism. And that doesn't apply just to Muslims. There are other communities, the Jewish community in the United States faces and has had dealt with historical anti-Semitism. There are other religious communities that when, for instance, we know that there have been campaigns against when a Hindu community wants to build a temple in a particular city, there have been anti-Hindu bias. So I'm just pointing out that there are multiple forms of bias around religion. And I think as professionals in the human resources and human development field, thinking about what is unique about anti-religious bias and what is also similar to, how does it play into other forms of bias that already exist? So empathy to me is really about understanding the perspective of someone's life from their viewpoint. And some of us call this perspective taking. And Carol Winter and Moskowitz do a lot of research in this area. And one of the things they say is it's not about walking in someone's shoes, because I can't walk in your shoes and have the same experience. I think you have red hair. I don't know what it's like to be a redhead. I understand that's a minority experience in the United States. But we can, for a moment, stand in someone else's shoes, and perspective thinking, or taking the perspective of the other, means just trying to understand your experience from the perspective of someone else. And in fact, this skill of perspective taking is considered one that is integral to problem solving. So I'm trained as a lawyer. So to be a good lawyer, I would actually want to know all the perspectives on the case. And I'm a better lawyer if I can argue all the different sides of the case, whether or not I believe in them or not. And so to kind of extrapolate from that, our workplaces become richer and people develop intellectually and cognitively if they begin to be able to understand experiences of others. And hopefully, I think there's understanding, acceptance, and then appreciation. I think we have to be careful that not everyone's ready to move to appreciation, and not everyone's ready to move to embracing. They may just be at the point where something is so, it evokes such a deep response that we have to sometimes meet people where they are and understand that over time, you will build the capacity, hopefully, for appreciation. But sometimes the intervention has to really fit the conflict. And I'll just kind of round up these comments. I remember going into institutions, whether it's a university or a workplace. I did some work with a large company that had a large fleet of truck drivers. And I remember going in, and if I ask the CEO or the head of HR, if I say, do you have any conflicts? And they say no, first of all, I know that they're not telling the truth. But I always tell people to be in community is to be in conflict. if an institution has built a culture where people actually care about each other and the mission, they will be in conflict. And so conflict is not a bad thing. It's an indication that people actually care about each other enough, or they care about their work enough to have a conflict with each other. So I think it's helpful when we think about empathy in general. This doesn't have to just do with anti-Muslim bias, but to think about the value of conflict, the value of growth, and not to jump into it with, as you know, a lot of us have legal obligations to jump into it with shutting down the conversation. So I think one of the most powerful learning experiences is going and transforming through the process of getting to know someone else through the shared workplace environment.
Yeah, 100% agree that conflict, that kind of learning and growing, and that growth mindset that you have to have in order to do that is really where innovation happens as a result of diversity. And I think I absolutely agree. That's really important. So how do leaders within the workplace, how do leaders build empathy in their organizations? What are some practical ways that they can address anti-Muslim bias, but also build empathy build empathy within their organizations?
I think part of the complexity of the Muslim identity in the United States, I mentioned already, for instance, the diversity, the racial diversity in the United States. There's also another element that deeply affects these dynamics, in addition to pre-existing racial discrimination, are also, since many Muslims come, also, in addition to what we just spoke about, when there's anti-African American bias in the workplace, adding to that, for many Muslims who have an international identity, such as myself, someone that, you know, immigrated from another country, that sometimes when incidents happen abroad, or they happen even here in the United States between communities, and there's an inflammation of tensions, that will come into the workplace. So part of anti-Muslim bias is that it exists not just here in the United States or in your community, but it can also find its way into your workplace between people of different traditions, whether they're cultural or religious, who may bring in conflicts that pre-exist the relationship of the workplace, and even may go back, some of these issues may go back for centuries. So I don't mean to, you know, to scare people off, but my point here is that it's a very rich identity. So there may be inflammatory speech that's used in the media that is based on something that happens elsewhere. And I think that's important to keep in mind, because sometimes the conflict management or intervention, you may see something that happens in the news and think it has no implication for what's happening in your workplace, because it's not related to the topic of research, it's not related to what you're producing. But in fact, there are ways in which these realities intersect. So because of that, one of the things I always tell people is it's much better to build relationships and trust in times of peace. It's much more helpful to be preemptive in our programming than, imagine there is something that happens, and this doesn't have to be related, as I articulated earlier, to external forces that are already engaging in society. But if there's a conflict that happens in the workplace, it's much better if we're able to be preemptive and do what I call in my work sort of prevention or conflict prevention before you have to move to the third party. So some of the things that are helpful kind of preemptively is, we talked about this notion of anti-Muslim bias, and that's programming that in some ways is negative, a negative response, an intervention response. But there are also ways to build programming throughout the year that showcase and articulate an appreciation of your employees and your team members that are Muslim, just as it would for others. So, you know, for instance, holidays are often a regular way we may celebrate holidays of one tradition or one community. And this is an invitation for Muslim team members to share maybe a way that they celebrate a holiday as well. I think we also need to look at culture and religion. For many people, they may not be strict observance of the religious tradition. So, you know, the percentage of Muslims that are going to ask for things like accommodation around ritual, for instance, around the 5-time daily prayer, that is an accommodation that some of your employees may be looking at. So one thing to keep in mind, a preventive thing, is to have a conversation and to learn about the religious tradition, to understand what are some of the accommodations. So some of the issues that often come up perennially are accommodation for prayer, accommodation or engagement around issues of fasting. Another that is also can be important is, for many Muslims, alcohol is not consumed, and even being around alcohol in social events or social settings can be very difficult. So I'll give you an example. In my work, a lot of the conferences I go to, professors mingle in bars. And I have colleagues who would teach their classes in bars. I hope we're not, I hope that, hopefully that's something that's slowly and gradually, for many reasons. I can only imagine all of you on this call could imagine the liabilities. But that is, again, not for all Muslims. And I think one of the things that's helpful is not to assume every Muslim is going to have the same set of needs. But that's one of the perennial issues that come up, when cultures are built around the consumption of alcohol. And it's not for someone who practices like me, it's not just about not drinking, or I never drink and I prefer not to be around alcohol. That's my level of practice. So how do I accommodate and deal with a workplace where so much of the socializing happens around alcohol? For some Muslims, the form of dress, as you can see with hijab, and some people don't wear it quite like I do. Others will wear it in a different way. It's vastly different. Imagine the world has more than 1 billion Muslims, and in the United States, we have probably 6 million or so of so many different cultural backgrounds. And for some Muslim men, the wearing of a beard is important. And in addition to all of those, for some Muslims, cross-gender touch, similar to some of the Orthodox Jewish community, physically touching one another can be a conversation that needs to be engaged. So those are some of the perennial issues that have come up when workplace, sort of at the interpersonal level, where there's conflicts at the interpersonal level, not necessarily around bias, but just around different practices where workplaces may really privilege or favor a different kind of practice. And it's really hard when you're the only one sometimes, I remember a colleague of mine, he was at a law firm, and they had a table for the Mormons and the Muslims. So it was this interfaith table at all their receptions, because none of the Mormons, that
also don't drink, right?
They don't drink. So they created this table at events where it was, and also there are people who don't drink for reasons of recovery, right? So it would end up with these three different groups of people at one table. So sometimes these are not issues just for Muslims. This could be an issue that you haven't seen or thought of. Just because it's not an issue for you doesn't mean it's not an issue for others. But one thing I really want to just put in here that's, I think, helpful for the conversation is Christopher Moore is a conflict resolution scholar, and he talks about two kinds of values: terminal values and day-to-day values. And he says terminal values are non-negotiable, deeply inherent to our identity in terms of values. The other are day-to-day, they're negotiable. So I cover my head. And I remember when I was in college, I went in for a job interview at a local health food store. And I went in for the job interview, I got the job. And the next day, the manager came in and said, "Oh no, you can't wear our smocks." I didn't want to wear the smock because it was ugly. And I said, "Oh no, I can't wear it. Why?" She goes, "Because it's blue." And I looked at her and I thought, "Oh, because it's blue." She thought because I was dressed differently that day. And I was also in my stage of college where I was into, at that time, I think more goth and emo music. So I was wearing all black. So she thought that my religious value, my terminal value, was the all Black clothing. And so the blue was a problem. But so it took me a minute to process that. And I told her, no, actually I can wear blue. I still didn't want to wear this knob. I said, I can wear blue, but what I can't negotiate is for me to remove my hair cover. So the modesty of my clothing was non-negotiable, but the color was negotiable. So I think it's really important. I was speaking at a conference and a woman said, oh, I know when diversity comes up in court cases. And I said, when? She said, when it's a name I can't pronounce. And I thought, oh my God, like that's when it's, just to point out that the way we see religion in particular, it's helpful to know what are the terminal values and what are the day-to-day values, because don't ascribe something as non-negotiable or negotiable when the person hasn't articulated to you yet what or how they want to deal with that.
Mm-hmm. I'm going to move on to Q&A in just a minute. So if anybody else has a question, please put it in the Q&A box. What is one thing that you most wish that allies knew, or that allies would take the time to learn in order to be a better ally for you?
And I think this is something that's a really good question that we talked about, is engage Muslims and normalize the conversation around Muslims in the workplace before there's an instigation of us having to be defensive. So I'll give you an example. I worked a lot with organizations that serve youth, and they wanted to do outreach to the Muslim community. But the only time they would do outreach is when they would essentially say, aren't Muslims all violent, which is an anti-Muslim bias, this idea that all Muslims, no matter who they are, commit violence. That's a really problematic assumption, obviously, for many reasons. But in their interest in being inclusive of the Muslim community, they would only invite Muslim speakers to come and prove that Islam is not violent. So even if our intention is to be positive, just be very careful. In conflict resolution, we say the most powerful form of power is actually convening people and bringing people together. So how are we building ways in which we normalize the conversation around being Muslim in the workplace? What are ways that we celebrate that identity as we celebrate others? And how do we look at the contributions so that it isn't just that we're trying to counter bias and that's the only time we talk about a Muslim identity? And I have to say, unfortunately, that's probably the strategy that's often used. Like, I think that is a responsive strategy, which is good. You need that strategy. But I think for allyship, that would be really helpful, is to have a conversation where we're not tiptoeing around it, where it's not scary, where it's not, where it's integrated into the education that we're doing already within the workplace. So I think as an ally, it's surprising. Sometimes people think that what's most helpful is to be out there leading and valiant and standing up. And I think, in fact, for a lot of folks in the workplace, they want to be able to have parts of their tradition privately, and then they want to deal with some of it publicly, and they want to engage with some of it in conversation. But I think negotiating that is going to be partly about your religious literacy, learning about the religious tradition. And I think that goes a long way in anti-bias education around religion in general, just increasing your religious literacy. So knowing that when someone comes to you with a concern, if you're already aware that Ramadan exists, Ramadan is there. I mean, what's so helpful, what's so helpful with allies is when I don't have to explain everything, or even not just explain, but justify everything. So I would just encourage us to really engage and develop religious literacy, particularly in the communities that are present in your workplace. Because Muslims are so vast in our diversity, where are the folks that are in your workplace? Where are they coming from? What is their background? And do some of that work on your own. It doesn't have to always be putting the burden on the employee. Being able to do some of that work on your own is really helpful. Are there more questions?
Yeah. So Maquiba asks, it's a similar question, but I think a little bit different, which is how can allies support our Muslim brothers and sisters in this moment? So with COVID-19, with everything that is happening, are there any specific things that are going on where we could be better allies for Muslims right now?
Absolutely. I think there are a lot of national efforts. There's actually a Black Muslim, for instance, COVID coalition that's emerged. So one of the things you can do, for instance, and that's why I said it's important to know who's in your workplace, is to many of these organizations, there's another one called Anti-Racism Collaborative, the Muslim Anti-Racism Collaborative. These are organizations that can come in and do specific training. And I think I mentioned this to you as well, Melinda, there are in almost every major metropolitan area Muslim Speakers Bureaus. And they have professionals. So if you are a tech professional, if you are a particular, in a particular industry, pretty much every major metropolitan area, because sometimes engaging that kind of professional organization, or as I mentioned, a issue-specific organization can be more, I think can be more relevant to a workplace than bringing in just, I think one of the things I would be careful about is bringing in just a religious leader, like an imam or a clergy member, because I think you need someone who has the capacity. There are also organizations that do interfaith work in nearly every city as well. So some of the resources I would draw on, do you have a specific issue? There are professional organizations for Muslims in tech. There is a collaborative organization for Muslims in the entertainment industry. So some of the suggestions I can make for allies are to try your best to engage people from the community and have a constructive conversation and to do your research, because I think it's always better to bring in someone from the community, because Islam, Christianity, Judaism, whatever religious tradition is not just about scripture, but it's about what we call lived religion. How are people living out this religious identity in their everyday life? And so I would just encourage you to also consider the employees you have before you do anything or before you put together a program. See what they need. I think needs assessment is really important, because sometimes it's misdiagnosing the need that can actually, you know, I remember growing up, I've been covering my head since about 6th grade. And I remember whenever the teacher would get to the section on Saudi Arabia or whatever the issue was, she would look at me and say, well, Najeeba, what do you have to say? And I think a lot of folks who come from minoritized perspectives have had their teacher do that. So we don't want to be that teacher when, you know, we call out the employee in front of everybody else. So that's where it takes building the relationships ahead of time. And also not framing the question always as a problem, but framing it as how can we, you know, are we doing a good job adding to your questionnaires for everybody? Are we doing a good job of representing and engaging the ways that you identify in the workplace? And if we're not, how could we do that better? So that's just something I wanted to point out. I think a lot of Muslims, being a minority religious community in the United States, while ethnically and racially it's a very diverse community, it's still a small community, and it's also a minority religious tradition in a country that is still largely Christian. So things like holidays are not just minor things. Our weekly religious Friday, this is another issue, is our weekly congregational prayers on a Friday, not on a Saturday or Sunday. So we're already dealing with a structural anti-Muslim bias. And by that, it's not necessarily negative in its intention, but in its implication. So you're dealing with people who carry perhaps a lot of struggle already with trying to just fulfill religious obligations. There's also one other piece that I wanted to add. For some Muslims, similar to the Jewish community, kosher meat, it's called halal or zabiha. For some Muslims, that's not for all Muslims. That's also an important factor in workplace issues. So for some, again. But I really...
Can you explain? What that is real quick.
Similar to the Jewish community, it's about how the animal was treated at the time of slaughter. So that process, and again, not all Muslims subscribe to that. You know, and then for many Muslims, for most Muslims, the idea of not eating pork is also, you know, so dietary restrictions come up. And it can be difficult often when you're the only one. And so another thing I think that allies can do, because Muslims, now in some industries, you may have a lot of Muslims, you know, in your workplace. So folks may not be in the minority in your workplace, but just keep in mind in general society, sort of the power reality is a minoritized power reality, even if you have a lot of Muslims in your workplace. So I think for the support of allies is knowing, for instance, that if I speak up about something, or if an employee speaks up about something, that they are going to be supported. And not just supported, I think, quietly. That's a problem with a lot of allies. They're willing to support us quietly on the side, you know, after we leave the meeting. It's when I work with religious groups, they talk about it as a parking lot conversation. I don't know if anyone drinks from water fountains anymore with everything that's happening, or if we even do everything in the workplace. But you know, I think this idea of how do we deal with being able to really have embodied solidarity when someone is dealing with difficulties and issues, and being able to be the one that maybe brings it up. So there is a story about my college years in a book on religious pluralism in the United States, and there were no other Muslims at my college, and so I fasted, and I was really lonely because there were no other Muslims. And my other students in my all-women's dorm, they actually woke up with me pre-dawn and surprised me and ate with me. You know, so those are the kinds of things that were really powerful, because what happened was, for me, is that it was about actually supporting me in a celebratory way, and hopefully there's reciprocity, not just, you know, I did the same with them for other religious traditions. Yeah. Clearly we could go on and on, but
we only have a few minutes left, but I wanted to try to combine two questions here. One is from Mohammed, who asks, for Muslims who move to the West, how do you suggest they start the conversation of no physical contact with people, especially if it's the first time they meet them? Is something a lot of people struggle with. And then the second, Fatma asks, how can we include Muslim identity as part of our whole identity and find our power within organizations?
Those are two really good questions. I think the question around physical contact is probably one of the most difficult, because it might be interpreted as being hostile. So I would recommend I would recommend not having that conversation when an incident happens, but as you come into the workplace, sharing that with a supervisor and explaining it and understanding how you would be able to function with each other. You know, so I think that's helpful, because what can happen is if we wait until someone's offended because there wasn't a kind of explanation ahead of time, then people can take things personally. Hopefully you would have a capacity to work through that still, but I would really encourage folks that as they come into a workplace, having that conversation ahead of time to explain that the purpose behind it is not, it's around religious practice and religious norms. It's not around an interpersonal, you know, negative feeling towards people of the opposite gender. And this actually applies both to men and to women. So there are men who practice this and women who practice this. A lot of times, unfortunately, it's only identified as with Muslim women, because I think of the hijab, where it's sometimes seen as different, but there are a lot of Muslim men who also prefer not to have physical contact with people of the other gender. And so I would just encourage us to also, when we're doing workplace trainings, have that be a topic, you know, what is your physical space like? Because it's not just, and I think it's always helpful when you don't just isolate Muslims, but there are other cultural practices where, you know, handshaking is not the most not every cultural community likes to do that. You know, physical space is different across cultures. So maybe in your workplace, don't just talk about Muslims, but also talk about what does it mean to have and to train people and say, you know what, one of the helpful things is before you enter into someone's personal space, whether by touch or getting close, see how they model it for you. If someone doesn't put their hand out for you, then model not putting your hand out, you know? So I would just encourage us to have conversations around physical space, how we relate to each other physically, because I think it's not just Muslims who have these boundaries. There are other people of other religious traditions, and also folks who just generally of different cultural and practices and cross-cultural communication. I think that's a good thing to learn when you travel as well around the world. Not everyone can see each other the same, right? So I think the more that you normalize a Muslim identity, and I don't mean here to make it normal for everybody, but normalize a conversation around it so that you relate it to this is some of the preferences that some Muslims may have, and how is that similar and different and relate to other ways that people relate, then it allows for the employee and the whole system of an organization to really understand that this person is not asking for a special accommodation. They're articulating, and they're going to have to do some negotiation too. This is an ongoing conversation. What was the second question? I think my quarantine brain can't remember.
No, you answered both. You did. You answered both questions at once. It was great. Perfect. Yeah. Perfect. My last question is, where can people learn more about your work?
I'm on Twitter at Najeeba Syeed, and then there's also my website, najeeba.com. So that you can do direct inquiries, and the speaking company and others can help bring it to me.
Thank you, Najeeba. Thank you so much for sharing your story, for sharing your passion, for sharing all of this amazing insight. Really appreciate that. We appreciate you.
It was an absolute pleasure. So I look forward to being in touch, and thank you for the audience. It was a very rich discussion.
Agreed, 100%. So everyone, keep this going, keep the conversations and the learning going, be brave, be courageous, and take new actions. Thank you for joining us today. Join us each week for Leading with Empathy and Allyship. You can sign up to attend with live audience Q&A like this, or you can catch the podcast or the video afterwards, and you can stay in the loop by going to changecatalyst.co, changecatalyst.co, and signing up for our newsletter. So don't forget to subscribe to our podcast, our YouTube channel, and we will see you next time. Thanks, everyone.